I am Anders Hagstrom with the Daily Caller. We're here for your Monday evening dispatch with Varun Hakari. Varun, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. So let's just dive right into it. It looks like this week, last week or last year was Infrastructure Week, and now we are officially into Eviction Moratorium Week. This is what we're going to be arguing about all week between, really among Democrats is where the argument is really happening because Biden has been placed in a really difficult situation where he doesn't feel that his administration has the authority to outright extend the eviction moratorium. Nancy Pelosi disagrees because she doesn't think she can get, or rather, she doesn't think that Congress itself can pass another eviction moratorium, and so they're all arguing about whose fault the end of this eviction moratorium is. But Varun, what are the details here? Who is right, and what are the arguments being made by Pelosi and really Biden here?
Yeah, so on one hand, you have the White House and President Joe Biden who are arguing that they do not have the authority as the executive branch to extend the eviction moratorium. Remember, back last year when the pandemic was first starting, the US government, both the current administration and the previous Trump administration, they continuously extended this eviction moratorium, which protected millions of people who didn't have jobs, who weren't able to make rent from being evicted from their own homes. And so, we can go back and forth on whether that was a smart policy, but the legality of it was always something that was being sort of placed under the microscope. And finally, the Supreme Court stepped in and they made a recent decision that said that the government can continue to make these extensions on the eviction moratorium, but that authority does not lie with the White House. The authority lies with Congress. And White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki told reporters that the CDC was not able to come up with a proper legal justification for extending the eviction moratorium. So that's the argument the president and the White House are making, that the executive branch does not have the constitutional authority. We can't go against what the Supreme Court has ruled. But Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats on the other side, they issued a joint statement over the weekend saying that action is needed and it must come from the administration. And so House Democrats are actually saying, you know what, the president does have the authority. He has executive orders that he can implement to extend the eviction moratorium. But again, this is sort of, Biden is caught between a rock and a hard place. He's caught between Nancy Pelosi and the Supreme Court. So it's this sort of conflict here between all three branches of government, which is really something you don't see very often. You have Congress, you have the White House, you have the Supreme Court that are all sort of fighting over what should be done about eviction moratorium. What is the correct way to go about this? So you're absolutely right. This is definitely sort of something that we're going to be talking about for the next week, possibly longer, because as these three branches of government, fight over the eviction moratorium, there are millions of Americans who are still struggling from the pandemic, who are sort of stuck figuring out, what's going to happen to me.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems that the Biden administration certainly has the stronger argument here. Obviously, if the Supreme Court tells you you can't do something, I mean, in the
Hmm.
U.S. system, that's sort of the end of the question. It means you simply can't do it.
Hmm.
But for the Supreme Court said that the CDC could extend it only if Congress actually passes legislation
Hmm.
saying as much, and obviously detailing how that extension would work, when it would end, that sort of thing. And so that's really what the reality of the situation is. And it seems
Hmm.
it seems to me that Nancy Pelosi is sort of trying to obfuscate that and say no,
Hmm.
the administration could do something if they wanted to, when in reality it's up to Congress. And clearly she doesn't seem confident that they could either get it through the House, or maybe Republicans in the Senate, she believes, would
Hmm.
oppose it. Or it's sort of interesting because obviously the original eviction moratorium began obviously under President Donald Trump.
Hmm.
And it existed through President Biden. Now, some Republicans, again, like you mentioned at the beginning, they've squabbled over the details here. How long should it have lasted? Is this costing a lot more than it's worth, at least now, than this late stage of the pandemic? But it's definitely interesting. You're right. You're right that Nancy Pelosi has definitely put Biden in an interesting position here.
But
Moving on to our last story here, because we were really talking about we sort of doubled up there at the beginning
hmm
with Biden and with Pelosi. But the Treasury. I mean, obviously, we've been talking about the debt since really 2010, the U.S. debt. I mean, Republicans for a long time it was their main issue, and then they sort of stopped talking about it when President Trump got into office, and now we're sort of back in this arena. And Janet, yeah, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says that the U.S. Treasury is going to quote extraordinary measures to prevent the U.S. debt from hitting the ceiling, from busting the debt ceiling. Varun, what does this mean? What are extraordinary measures? Haven't we just like broken our debt ceiling before? Does the debt ceiling matter? What's going on here?
Yeah, the debt ceiling is one of those like cat and mouse games that Congress likes to play with itself every few years. When Republicans are in power, it's the Democrats who are complaining about debt. When the Democrats are in power, now it's the Republicans who are complaining about debt. Yeah, so the debt ceiling is this interesting question when it comes to procedure and how the US economy interacts with Congress. So, what's sort of happened for decades is that every time we hit this debt ceiling, Congress votes to increase that ceiling, and that's been done continuously. Because if we don't increase the ceiling, the US ends up defaulting on debt, and that's really, really bad. Almost every economist will tell you that interest rates would spike, there'd be all sorts of economic problems if the US was to default. But that's why we keep raising the debt ceiling. So, what happened was that back in August 2019, Congress, as part of a budget plan, voted to on a 2-year suspension of raising the debt ceiling. So they basically allowed the debt to continue to increase. And obviously, with the pandemic, the amount of federal spending has skyrocketed, and Biden wants trillions of dollars in additional spending. So I think the debt went from about 22 trillion back in 2019 to now almost 29 trillion. So that's $7 trillion in spending over 2 years. But now that 2-year extension has lapsed as of Sunday at midnight because Congress did not reach a deal. So that's why Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said that she is stepping in with some quote extreme measures. She announced this in a letter last week to congressional leaders. And so these extreme measures basically mean that the Treasury Department is going to be purchasing US government obligations. That's things like Social Security, military spending, anything that's non discretionary that the US government has to spend money on. That also includes paying interest back on the debt that we already have. The Treasury Department will issue bonds to pay for these obligations without accruing any further debt. So it's basically a get out of jail free card for the US government, for Congress. They don't have to spend this money, the Treasury stepping in. The problem is they can only do this for about 2 to 3 months. Janet Yellen warned Pelosi in her letter last week that they kind of have to get the situation resolved by October 1st. If they don't, we could seriously be in the position of defaulting on our debt, which would be unprecedented. So now the onus is on Congress to come back together and to say, hey, we need to figure this out. We need to agree on what to do with the debt. Now, it's very, very likely that Congress is going to vote to raise the debt ceiling once again, because that's what they've always done. At the same time, now you have Republicans who are very interested in the debt again, who are saying, wait a minute, why don't we reduce spending instead? So as the government continues to push for these multi-trillion-dollar spending agendas, because that's what the Democrats and President Biden want, I think what's going to happen is that come October, Congress will vote to increase the debt ceiling once again, and the federal government's spending bonanza is going to continue.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's definitely a tale as old as time. The with the debt ceiling, it seems like every few years it just sort of happens, and Republicans and Democrats will bicker about it for
Mhm.
a few weeks, and then they'll just sort of shrug their shoulders and raise the debt ceiling. It's sort of just
Yeah,
a great American tradition, and we look forward
absolutely.
to doing it once again in October.
Mhm.
Varun, thank you so much for coming on. We'll keep you guys informed, and Patriots, thanks for watching.